I often tell this story of, well, this is my first or second year teaching. And I had a kid in my class who she just never smiled. I just wanted kids to smile and enjoy being there. And so that notion evolved over time, and I began to, kind of wrap it around this idea of joy.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Today I'm joined by one of my favorite humans, Dean Shareski. Dean is what you might call an educational polymath. He's had many different roles in education. He's formerly an elementary school teacher, district administrator who supervised tech adoptions and implementations. He's lectured at both Wilkes University and the University of Regina, and was a community builder for educators across Canada and the US through his work in EdTech. He's also an author whose wonderful book titled Building a Culture of Joy, How Educators Can Bring Joy to the Classroom Each Day is, in my opinion, a must-read for all educators, especially those that feel burnout creeping in. Dean has also been a keynote speaker across the globe and hosts his own podcast called the Canadian Ed Leadership Podcast. On top of all of this, he's an extremely proud grandparent, and his perspective on childhood and education is really deeply shaped by a belief in preserving the wonder of growing up. And if you follow him on social media, you'll be treated to his often delightful takes on sports, family, in addition to learning and education. So I'm truly grateful to have Dean on the show. For me, Dean has been my guide through K-12 education for nearly a decade. Together, we've traveled across provinces, states, districts of all size from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, all really in the name of supporting digital implementations and helping build teacher capacity and community. So having him as one of my guests feels not only important, but really meaningful. For those of you who already are fans of Dean Shareski, and I know there are many of you, there are a few surprises in today's conversation, especially when it comes to his formative years in Morton, Manitoba. But what always stands out with Dean is his humor, humility, candor, and curiosity. All qualities that make him a beloved figure in education, in particular in Canada, which does not really adopt or like education gurus. Something that I feel is very Canadian, but this is probably a conversation for another day. In today's conversation, we discuss topics that include why fostering community and empowering teachers to explore new ideas and technologies is vital in classrooms. We also touch on the centrality of joy in education and how it actually leads to better learning outcomes. We discuss the role of curiosity in learning, the similarities and differences in education systems in Canada and the US, the importance of school principals in creating positive and innovative cultures, and the importance of giving students agency. So without further ado, I now present you my conversation with my friend, Dean Shareski. So, Mr. Shareski, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Where does this podcast find you today?
It finds me in my wife's. That's the thing. You're bugging me about the whole background thing. So if I don't have a nice clean background like you, I've got sewing things. It's basically her sewing room that I've turned into the office here in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. So that's where I am today.
I feel that's very reflective of how eclectic the Shareskis are. So it's got nice patterns in the end.
Yeah.
Okay, Dean. So I would have given you a proper intro here as to why you're on the podcast, why I find you to be one of the interesting folks in the education space across North America. But can you give the audience a brief overview about you and the work you do?
Well, I am a 30 plus. I haven't counted for sure if it's 32 or 33 years in education. Everything from classroom teacher to district technology coordinator lead. And then the last 12 years, I have been really serving communities all across North America in a lot of different capacities. So everything from keynote speaking, written a couple books, and now working with advanced learning partnerships really around just supporting communities across Canada and the US in service of professional learning, whatever that may be. I mean, it's a lot of things that we do, a lot of stuff around generative AI, which I know we'll talk probably a little bit more about, but I sometimes feel like I'm a jack of all trades, master of none, and that I can do a lot of different things, and I don't sort of stay in one particular lane. I think there's some themes and things that we'll explore that I try to embed in all of my work, but a lot of different experiences and opportunities that I've had in the last little while that I feel very privileged to have had experience and I've been part of.
Excellent. And I certainly want to dive into, again, a bit of the eclectic nature of your education experience, because I think the audience, I think broadly will be familiar with you and your work, but maybe not all the different wrinkles, shall we call them. So let's maybe start with giving folks a bit of a sense of your background. Where and when did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in southern Manitoba in a small town called Morden, Manitoba, which is, to this day, I look back and think I can't even imagine a better place to have grown up and a better time. I think about, I'm on the cusp. Sometimes I'm a Gen Xer, sometimes I'm a baby boomer, depending on how those things go. But, grew up in, the 70s really is my kind of era of growing up. And small town Manitoba is pretty idyllic when I look back at that, really having the opportunity to just do a lot of things in a small enough town where you can participate in every activity that was there. Not as many activities and opportunities perhaps that exist in today's world, but certainly enough to kind of keep me busy and engaged, but also a healthy balance of free time and boredom that allows you to kind of, experience the world in maybe some different ways than our kids do today. So lots of sports. Sports was a focal point of growing up. Really, really diverse friends. I hung out with a lot of older kids for whatever reason. So I don't know. I think sometimes about how that may have shaped me in some ways, but loving family, 2 older sisters. I was kind of an only child by the time I was 11. My sisters are 7 and 10 years older than I am. So I kind of have a little bit of that vibe some days, but yeah, it's just, I have nothing but fond memories of my childhood.
Is there anything about your upbringing and maybe the way you played as a child that you wish children today could experience?
I hate going to the, back in the good old days kind of thing. And I think a lot of us, can see that in today's world, there's just a lot of things that our kids, and I've got grandkids, which is kind of the lens through which I see education in the world today, that they just may not ever have an opportunity to do. Just the freedom, right? I was talking about the fact that, can you imagine today? And we talked about this the other day. If they called your house and asked where Ben and Zoe were, and you said, "I don't know," that doesn't happen very often, right? Like, where your kids are at all times and exactly where they are and what they're doing and so forth. Well, people would call our house and say, "Is Dean there?" And my mom wouldn't have a clue, or I don't know where he is. He should be home later, kind of. That's about all. So that freedom to sort of explore the world and just go where you wanted to go and get into a little bit of trouble sometimes. And we're so safety conscious and I understand that in some respects, but there's just something kind of wonderful about kids getting into a little bit of trouble, and making a few mistakes and figuring out together. I think about just playing hockey and baseball and football where there's no adults. You just showed up and there's a bunch of kids there and you figured out the game. And if there was a couple short, you made the adjustments, you just negotiated all those things. And it was wonderful. I played a lot of organized sports, but probably my fondest memories were the times where there was no adults around. We just played. And I just think that in general is not something that kids today experience. And this is not certainly not, kids aren't to blame for that. And maybe not even parents. It's the society that's emerged. And it's very difficult to kind of go beyond that. I know you talk about taking your kids up to your cabin and sort of there's a hint of that there, right? Where they just are less connected in so many ways. So they get a little bit of taste of that, but I would love to see, somehow to bring that back for my 3 grandkids and all kids really to experience childhood in a little bit more unstructured way.
Yeah, I think you nailed the same kind of thing that I want to convey to my children and to those listening with theirs, is just to find ways to give them that sense of freedom. So for me, the freedom, my freedom as a 12-year-old, it's right around 12. My parents gave me a little more responsibility. My bike was my passport to freedom. I got on my bike and went neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood, and I just remembered that feeling. So I think there are ways to do it. And you mentioned, a couple getting back out to nature and just kind of fighting your protective nature as a parent to let kids out and do it. Do you see any of those opportunities for your grandkids? Like obviously your kids are also well educated and they have a sense of the importance of these kind of things. Do you see them, having those opportunities?
Well, I'm certainly the one in the family that's more apt to try those things with kids. So my oldest granddaughter, Harriet, she's 6. And she always wants, like, we'll go to the playground, which is maybe 3 or 4 blocks from their house. And she said, "Can I walk home by myself?" And, if it were back in my day, of course, go by yourself. Like, there's no doubt. But I know, there's a little trepidation. So it's like, okay, you go walk and I'll stay a couple blocks behind you and sort of be there a little bit. But I mean, I try to do those things. And yet when I tell, my daughter what I did, she's like, "Oh, I don't know if she should be doing that." So I'm pushing the envelope to say, like, yeah, but they need to do that. And of course, when you go to the what's the worst can happen, well, they could get run over by a car. That's obviously a pretty bad scenario. And so thinking about any kind of a situation where they can have some independence, and the worst that can happen is probably not that bad. That's what I'm seeking. Yeah. So I look forward in, how can I give them more independence? How can I just kind of make them feel that freedom? But I got to say, it's difficult. And so any little opportunity for them to, go into the store by yourself and buy this thing or whatever it might be, I look for those opportunities and try to amplify them. And I mean, there's something intuitive that kids actually want to do that, but they are less apt. And that's the thing I'm encouraged by her. She wants to be independent. She wants to go, and explore some of these things herself. And yet I think lots of kids just are growing up into a very risk averse world and don't even think there's a possibility that they could have some independence, that they could hop on their bike and drive to a friend's house without, some tight supervision or calling ahead or whatever the parameters we put on these things now. So the opportunities are definitely fewer, but I try my best to capitalize on any chances I can get to give them that.
Yeah. Well, and I like the way you kind of approach it. You're encouraging them to take a risk, but you're providing a sort of safety net that they're not even aware of. I think that's the best way to do it. You're providing them with the safety, but they got to not know it's there so they can fully experience that freedom.
Well, and my favorite, the example that was so glaring to me is this is probably 4 years ago when Harry was like 2. We'd go to the playground and we'd be there and I'd be there with her dad. And so she'd be climbing up some apparatus and she couldn't quite get there herself. So she's kind of stretching her leg and I'm just like, I'm right behind her, not touching her, but just there in case she falls. And she struggles and I might just give her a little bit of help, but kind of let her do it independently. She gets up there and she's excited. I go sit down. My son-in-law takes over. She's climbing up this thing and struggling. He picks her up and just puts her on top and kind of like, it's over. Like he's doing this from a perspective of safety and maybe just let's get on with it or like just get to the goal.
Well,
but no, you missed out on the struggle. Yeah, you missed out on like that was she felt so good that she was able to do it, even though she didn't quite do it by herself. But in her mind, it's like, yeah, I did this thing, and so I think that's kind of a microcosm of some of the differences in parenting and in our world today.
Yeah, that might also be the difference between parenting and grandparenting. Like the parents sometimes are thinking, it's like, I don't have time. Like I know nothing bad would happen, but I've got 0 time for stitches today in the emergency room. Today I'm going to get home, make dinner, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's great. But let's turn the focus, because I know you can speak about your grandkids and certainly provide us a lot of lessons, and maybe we come back to that. But tell me a little bit about your education. What aspects of your education stand out?
I was one of those kids who, school was just a thing you did. I would never say I like school. I didn't hate school, but I didn't like school. It's just like, yeah, you go to school, it's fine. And I was a good student, so school was easy for me. It didn't have a lot of homework. I was thinking about that the other day. I'm sure when I was in high school, maybe I brought an essay home to work on or something of that nature, but it was not a big part of it. So I always kind of felt good about the fact that my homework wasn't really a thing for me. And again, I remember that I have a few teachers that I kind of remember in terms of they stood out for different reasons, some good, some bad. But it was fine. But I also think about the fact that, that was a time where schools kind of had an unwritten rule, if you will, and an agreement between home and school. Home is where you deal with all those personal, emotional, social kinds of things. School is for academics and content. And, if you've got behavior issues or issues with, social emotional learning, as we would call it today, that's a mom and dad job. That's not a school job. And, I was fortunate. I grew up in a very loving family where we traveled, we read, we did all the kind of things that you would want from your parents. And so school just became pretty easy, an easy thing for me. But I don't, and that was the thing too, like getting into education myself was kind of a weird thing because I was never thinking that was going to be something that was, because I didn't really care for education or had any particular affection for my K-12 education.
So when it comes to learning, what was the first thing that you fell in love with? So just ask a different way. What was your first love when it came to learning? What did you love to learn?
Well, I would probably say geography, and that came from sports. I was the guy. I could tell you where all these cities in the U.S. were. I knew the names of the I studied that stuff because I would watch a game and I'd look at, oh man, Los Angeles is playing New York. That's got to be a crazy long flight. That's the stuff that captured my attention. So I was always fascinated by just studying the world and geography. So that's sort of the way it came, and probably as another byproduct of my love of sports was some interest in mathematics as far as statistics go, because I love statistics. I could tell you I memorized stats. I understood them. I kind of, and it's weird because I still have a kind of an affinity for data in many respects today. I can tell you exactly how many birdies I've had this year on my golf game and all my scores. And so I continue to track that. So I really like data. So I would say, again, as a byproduct of my love of sports, geography and math probably were my first things that I came to love.
How about what you studied that most impacted how you think and work today?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know if that's anything that I can pinpoint. Certainly in my, I don't know of anything that in my K-12 education or that I would say, well, that's been a big influence in kind of how I think today. I mean, I think just my overall upbringing and experiences and kind of belief about joy, which is another thing that emerged later on. That wasn't something that I could articulate or even knew, although it was certainly something that I certainly had all of my life. But I don't know that I can pinpoint something that has influenced my learning experience. Probably what I would say, if I can jump way ahead, excuse me, just get a drink of water. And now I'm going into probably 25 years ago, there was a keynote talk that a guy by the name of Dave Weinberger, who I believe Dave Weinberger is, he's either at Harvard or MIT, talking about the changing nature of information and really kind of capturing the idea that this digital world is different and we have to handle information differently because of it. That was I think, a seminal moment sort of in my transformation as an educator, for sure.
So, in the work you've done really across North America and beyond, let's get into some of the things you've seen that I think our audience would benefit from. I would struggle to think of somebody that's been to more jurisdictions and work with more, superintendents, principals, teachers than you have. So let's start with something I think a lot of folks would be interested in. Can you describe the most inspiring things you've seen in your work over, say, these last 12 years?
Well, I think when I think of inspiring things, there's certainly innovations and or programs, initiatives that take place that are inspiring. But I think more about kind of the long term, like who's in it for the long game. So anybody can kind of, whether it's launching a robotics program of something of that nature that, kind of has some sexiness and appeal. I think more about inspiring, like who's kind of doing this and sticking with this in the long haul. And I think there's some obvious places that maybe some people would be familiar with. You think about a high-tech high in San Diego, and I had an opportunity to work with Caleb Rashad a little bit, who's one of the leaders in that organization. So super engaged and again, have been doing this for a number of years. So that's inspiring to see something that has that kind of traction. And then I think about, some of the other outstanding leaders, whether it's like Chris Kennedy or Dave Eberwein, Kevin Godden. I mean, I'm mentioning all British Columbia folks at this time, but then, there's other ones, John Malloy. And I think when I think about them, I think about, well, they're impacting culture in the long term. Like, they're trying to make a big difference. And I think, that raises, when you start pulling back from that and you begin to grasp the complexity of organizations, of schools and school districts, they are highly complex institutions that are not easily changed or moved. And so it's fascinating to examine, why is it that certain places have had those successes? And again, when you're in the middle of it, it's like, it's the difference between weather and climate, right? I mean, the weather changes often and they might go through some times that aren't as great or whatever. But when you kind of pull back and you think, okay, but over 4 or 5 years, these guys have consistently kind of rocked it. They have a place where people want to go work there. And I think that's the real testament, right? Like, who wants to work there? Who wants to be a part of this place? And when people are pounding on the door, wanting to get in, wanting to be part of it, I think you've kind of proven your worth, that these are places where people want to go, people want to be.
Yeah, those are certainly 3 great leaders, certainly across Canada, and actually all 3 are scheduled to be interviewed here on this podcast. But maybe leading up to that, what would be great is, you've interviewed now, well over 50 education leaders across Canada. What are the qualities you most admire in really great ed leaders?
Yeah, and I mean, I always kind of reference, when I talk about leadership, I always reference the book, The Nine Lies About Work, one of which is leadership is a thing, that not being a lie, according to Ashley Buckingham in his book. Because if you look at leaders in general across society and across history, there's no common trait to them. I mean, they there's charismatic leaders, there's quiet leaders, there's assertive leaders, so to pinpoint sort of characteristics is difficult. Now, that said, I probably would want to make the argument that in education, though, there are some through lines. And I think one of them is humility. And I think that's true because you are dealing with, not just human beings, but children, and the fact that like they're fragile, and you have to have, a degree of empathy, but also humility in being able to pause and say, well, boy, we've got to sort of adapt to the students that we have, and sort of, and just being open to creating cultures where you get to hear from a lot of different people. Like it's not a great industry to be really, kind of what we see in the business world, where somebody's just like just pounding ahead with one idea and one vision, because there are so many things. You're not just trying to accomplish one thing. You're trying to accomplish a myriad of things and trying to please a myriad of stakeholders. And so your ability to, bring with you great people to support you. And because I think there's examples of people that don't. Like, I don't need a lot of people, because if you're just trying to, win at business or at sports, whatever, I think you can be a little bit more sort of direct and sort of take on that role. But I think in education, it's really important that people they're humble, they're empathetic, and they're collaborative. I would probably put those three as the top qualities that I've seen, and are evident maybe in different ways, but exist in most of those top leaders that I've spoken with and have been around.
So related to that, in your experience, what do the best classrooms look like, sound like, feel like?
Well, I think there's certainly a sense of ownership from the students, right? They are in that place, and it is teacher and student who have created a community together. So that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're talking about a kindergarten classroom or grade 12 classroom. The fact that the students feel like education is not just being done to them, that they have a say in, the way the room looks, the kind of things they do. Now, that still requires a leader. The teacher is the leader, but I think there's a sense of that this is our place. Like, I feel, we talk about belonging. We talk about a lot of those things that are really integral and things we want. But we create that by inviting students into that process as early as possible, in terms of like, how do we want to operate? How do we want to be together? How are we going to manage this? And again, I think, part of my job description over the years has been community leader and building community. So that's something I really feel strongly about. And, when I try to make the parallel to the classroom, it is there. However, it's important to acknowledge that a classroom is a bit of a pseudo community, in that, most communities you choose to be a part of. I mean, these kids are sort of thrown together. These are the kids you have, whether they want to be there or not. So you have to kind of take that a little bit in consideration, that it's not a true community, but you can still work towards having kids feel like, yeah, I would. I mean, you always kind of, the question always kind of comes is, if kids didn't have to go to school, would they go anyway? Which is always a great litmus test of, the sense of belonging and community that you've created. So in those classrooms that you say, what do I see the best things happening? That's what I feel like. I mean, and that can happen using a lot of technology. It can happen without a technology, but just a sense of community and belonging, and that they feel like the teacher is just on their side, like just cheering them on, wanting them to succeed. Like, I'll do whatever it takes to make you successful. And if you can give them that sense of support, that's when kids thrive.
Well, so you've done a lot of thinking about the role of joy in the classroom, and it's kind of dawning on me that You have always probably been using joy as one of the fundamental building blocks to community in the classroom. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And again, I probably did it without articulating it in such a way, even when I first began. I often tell this story of, well, this is my first or second year teaching. And I had a kid in my class who, like, she just never smiled. Like, she just was just always like had that. And that was like, just bugged me. Like, you're 6 years old, you're 7 years old. Like, you should smile. Like, life. I mean, listen, I didn't know, maybe there's bad stuff going on in our family. So I'm not saying, she didn't have a reason to be that way. But at the same time, I'm hoping that maybe coming to school with your friends could be a time where you'd smile and enjoy it. So I just remember that whole year, it was in the back of my head. I was like, I want to make Christina smile as much as I can. So whether I would tell her a joke or whether we would, something happen that would be funny, and I would immediately, how when you're watching something and you're, let's say you're showing me a comedy clip and you look at the person that you want them to laugh, right? Like, I hope they find this funny. That's how I felt with her. Like, I just wanted, when something would happen, I know I would instinctively look at her to see, did she smile? Did she think that was kind of funny? And, that was kind of the start of it. Is at the end of the day, like, I just wanted kids to smile and enjoy being there. And so that notion evolved over time, and I began to, kind of wrap it around this idea of joy. But that's kind of where that started, is like, why, like, I mean, it's like, listen, there's a lot of books I've read. One of my favorite books is The Book of Learning and Forgetting by Frankie Smith, who I think he was a University of Toronto professor. And it's, I don't know when the book was written, like late 90s. And I mean, he talks about the fact that, we learn by the company that we keep. So it doesn't matter if you're a gang member, like, you'll learn gang stuff if that's what you're doing, right? Whoever you hang out with, if you're a part of the reading club, I'm going to be a reader because that's what everybody here does. I want to be in that club. I'm going to do it. And it kind of, sort of de-emphasized in many ways the role of the teacher. Like, and you think about your own kids and their ability to read. I mean, yeah, school's not hurting them, but probably more than anything else, they learn because their mom and dad read, you read to them. They're going to learn to read whether or not they go to school. All of that to say, I realized that learning wasn't dependent on me. Like, kids will learn, like, whether or not they go to school or not. I mean, we've only had public education in our world for a couple hundred years at the most. And people weren't stupid before that. They learned. And so if that is the true, then what else? Then this becomes a question that people are asking all the time. So if it's not about content, then what is it for? And for me, that was the thing that I really prided myself in, is I wanted kids to have a joyful learning experience. And so I would work towards that end, so that it wouldn't just be the drudgery of learning, but like, how can we figure out a way to make this, sometimes it was about fun, sure, but just sometimes, like, can you look back and just smile and say, that was an awesome thing we did, whether it was hard or whether it was not. I mean, hard was great too. It wasn't about making things easy, but it was about, like, that kind of was what I wanted them to feel when it came to learning.
Yeah, and I've seen you give keynotes on joy. I mean, certainly more times than I can easily remember. And some of the things that have stood out to me really is how you really position even some goofy little things like, that maybe you can describe in better detail. I believe it was in your wife Paula's classroom where, they would put ping pong balls attached to a belt in a Kleenex box, and they'd have to shake their butts and hips to get the ping pong balls out. And it was just something that nobody in their right mind can watch without hysterically laughing, and nobody can do it without having an inordinate amount of fun. Now, from the pedagogy side, when I've seen you, use that as an example of joy, I've seen some superintendents kind of be like, oh, okay, but they're not learning anything. But having seen you do this talk and the work you've done and the book you've written, it's obvious as a tool to build the foundation for relationships and for an atmosphere that is very conducive to learning. Now, did I get that right? Is there anything you'd add to that?
No, and that's just it. I mean, I would often joke saying like, I don't know where this fits into your, Ontario or whatever curriculum standard, objective, expectation. It doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't fit in.
Right. By the
But
way,
again, that
just
investment.
out of sheer ignorance, is joy mentioned in the curricula at all? In anyone? Like, do you ever
It's
see
not really mentioned in curriculum, but what I will say is that I've seen, in fact, I was just working with a school district today in Atlanta, and they actually use the word joyful learning in that, which I just go, yay! Like you're acknowledging the fact that this is actually matters, and we want this to be a thing. And I remember, often sharing something like that, and I would have a teacher that would come up to me afterwards and say, I do those things, but I don't want anybody to know about it because it makes me look like I'm not as professional or I'm not getting through. But I mean, they know that pays off in the long run in the same way that if you meet somebody and you're going to a meeting, you don't start off with agenda number 1. You talk about how's it going. You talk about what are your kids doing. All that is building social capital. And with kids, you got to do that all the time, every day. And at the same time too, like I always remember people talking about the fact that maybe the 5 hours they spend at school, what if those were the best 5 hours of that kid's day? How do I make this the best 5 hours they're going to have? And that's going to include that. And I never apologized for that. And that was something I wanted teachers, superintendents, whoever else to not apologize for doing those things, and not because we got into and I think we're coming out of it, I would say in many regards, but we got into a really bad tailspin of, canceling anything that didn't have a strong curricular focus and like, no, that doesn't meet our minutes. Then we're not going on a field trip. We're not having assembly, all those things.
Yeah. Maybe this is a good opportunity, to talk a little bit about the differences between the Canadian and US system. Correct me if I'm wrong. This idea of rigor, I think, gets mentioned a lot more, even like if you just look statistically in curricular documents in the US. And that rigor leads to testing, and that testing leads to funding. And that's not the case in Canada. There's certainly a much more, I think, flexible approach around all those things. I mean, you can pick up on that thread or on anything else, but do you think that's one of the main differences you see between the Canadian education and US education systems?
You've kind of nailed it. So the two things are, I think, first of all, Americans, greater love of capitalism than ours. Not that Canadians aren't capitalistic, but in that success has to be measured. Success has to be like, that's how like you have to be really clear about measuring and ranking and all those things and winners and losers. That's an American, certainly bias. And then the second part is what compounded that was, especially during probably when I first, mid 90s into the 2000s, this was the era of No Child Left Behind and so forth. And then there was just this rampant emphasis that education is failing. Schools are failing us. And so they got a bit of a complex around, the fact that we're just not doing very well. And I would often make the argument that, like, I don't know that that's 100%. I mean, the difference between America and Canada, just in general, is the degree of diversity, right? Americans have a way wider spectrum of both everything, right? Rich and poor, greater disparities, in almost every aspect of they're great, they're awesome is really, really awesome. And sometimes they're bad is really, really bad. And I think that's true in education. Ours is a little bit more narrow in terms of the continuum of good, bad, and others. But that, I think, drove it. And so then became like, we have to sort of position our school as this idea as this rigor kind of idea. And I mean, the fact that they are, at very early ages, trying to prepare kids for career in college, like kindergartens and first graders talking about those things then. And it's like, gee whiz, slow it down. Like, can kids just be kids for a little while before they have to figure it out? But that said, I'm empathetic towards that. So I was in Southern Georgia last month, and I mean, it's high poverty, and outcomes and outlook is not great for some of those places. And so they are looking to schools to be ways to get kids out of poverty and get kids better outcomes in life. And so I understand it. I definitely understand it. But again, it's compounded. But I mean, yes, I would say that American education is very much that way. And that's not to say that Canadian education is so much better. It's different for sure. We've never really bought into testing as being the primary way we measure success. It is still there, and it's still a part of the system, but it's not the only way in which we measure success. And there's also a difference too. I think the STEM is always a really good differentiator. So STEM in the US always was positioned as, these are the jobs of the future. We got to teach kids about science, technology, engineering, and math. That's what we got to do, because this is their future. Certainly true. In Canada, STEM was, that's interesting, but also STEM is a really cool way to do inquiry, to think about the world, to understand the world. And so there was much less of a focus on, this is for your future, as to, this is actually a really cool thing to learn now. So why not do it? So I think those are some just differences of thinking. There's just more of an urgency in the US to have education produce a job, a career, a life of success. And in Canada, the emphasis is much more around, like, we want good citizens. Like, the job stuff, we'll worry about that. It's not that we ignore that or don't. I mean, there's lots of really, and I can give you examples of places that are doing really intentional work around providing kids opportunities for careers. So it's not that we don't do it, just that I think we have a little bit of a broader outcomes for kids beyond just getting them a job.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say the approach to testing is very different, and that has, big macro level outcomes when you extend that out over millions of kids and dozens of years. I bet if there was a way to test how good test takers are, Americans score probably top in the world, because they just spend so much time taking actual tests. Like, you divert from the learning when you're spending that much time when you add it up, right? We also don't have SATs, and I know SATs could actually be we're probably started as a way to actually measure, somebody's performance. So things like race, class didn't come into it. But at the same time, over the years, that system has been co-opted by those with more means. And obviously we've seen all the scandals of, rich and famous kids getting into systems, or getting into universities not based on merit. Right. So that's one of the other things. The biggest differentiator, I would say, and you pointed to it, and the Canadian superintendent told me this a long time ago, that our floor is much higher than the US. So the basic fundamentals of the education system are much higher for the average Canadian child as they are to the US. Now, this is important for, I think, Canadian parents to understand, because I don't hear a lot of praise for the Canadian education system, but you and I that have worked in other jurisdictions kind of have a better sense of this than most folks, right? So, for example, all across the country, in every province, our teachers are paid a living wage. No teacher, unless they really want to, work second jobs, right? It's not like it is in the US and certain states where, the level of the educators is just different. So that's one piece. The other piece is how the actual per capita student funding happens, right? Anything you would want to add to that in terms of what you've seen and how it's played out across the two countries?
Well, no, but just to add, even talking about salaries, again, that's a great example because the lows are crazy low in some places, and yet there's places in like whether it's outside of Chicago or Connecticut, some of these places where their salaries are significantly higher than, not significantly higher, but higher than some of our top, um, our salaries. And so again, I think that's a structure of the system. Even though education is done province by province in Canada, they pay close attention. So everyone's comparing teachers' wages in Saskatchewan to Ontario and to other places. Whereas in the US, with all 50 states, it is a greater range in that. So I think that's just a classic example of how that disparity kind of works in the US and how we work to sort of fight that.
So if I could turn your focus to give some advice to parents, right? We're spending a lot of time here talking about educators, the systems, a little bit of the difference between the American and Canadian systems at a very high level. I understand that. But can you kind of give the same high level overview for a parent about what are the most important things to understand about the education system as they help their kids navigate it?
Well, I mean, you're battling between wanting your kid to be the best they can be, which is, that's honorable. That's the right thing to do. But also like getting caught up in the in the weeds of grading or whatever it is. So, like in the end, it just doesn't matter. Like, so right now we're supporting my wife's nephew, he's not a great student. And he's living with us right now, trying to finish his education. He's in grade 10 and, he passed everything. He's the kind of kid, like he's never, like his future is not probably in academia. It's not. He's going to be, hopefully get a great job in the trades or something like that, which is an awesome life to build. We're trying to say, like, you just need to develop some good habits, like, because those habits are the things that are going to serve you in the future. So just, whether it's just being on time, whatever those habits are, build those
study habits.
Yeah. And study habits. And because it's not about the courses you're taking, really. In the end of the day, colleges, even employers, they don't really care about that. So develop that for the sake of, those are skills that will serve you well forever. But don't get caught up in sort of the, and especially again, if I talk to parents that are privileged, like you, and like, I would say, like, your kids are fine. Like, your kids are involved in a lot of things outside of school that some would say, well, at some point that's going to take away from their schooling. It's fine. They'll do okay. That's not a problem. And so, if you're in a position to make those choices, to choose things like traveling over school, I do that. And if you're in a situation, again, if I'm talking to a parent that maybe doesn't have that kind of luxury, that whether it's through economics or maybe their kids just struggle in school, just help them to develop, like, focus on what are most important. And those are those kind of life skills. They may not show up in the grades. They may not be able to achieve well that way. But if they're the kind of kid who is, polite, can learn those skills and can do that, they will be successful. They might not have, be outstanding in their school career, but they will be successful. And listen, I think most teachers also understand that, although they're certainly going to advocate for, hey, I want your kid to do better. And if I'm a math teacher or whatever that might be, but in the end, I think they also realize, like, that's not really the most important thing, is this math class. The most important thing is, like, what kind of a human being are we helping to support and build?
Yeah, what kind of citizen we want to build, I think, is a good question. So let me flip that question then. For teachers, what recommendation do you have for teachers?
Well, when I think about teachers today, and I'm honestly very concerned, and I talk about this a lot, is the sustainability of the work that they're doing. And it is, In some cases, it is not sustainable. It's difficult. They're being asked to do a lot of things that is causing them to burn out and not want to be a part of it. And so if you're in that situation, I think about your only way out of that in most cases is to find a principal, starting a school with a principal who's very supportive of you, who you feel like you can work under. Because to me, that's the differentiator that I've seen, is that teachers who feel good about their job, who have success, have great leaders that are doing the hard work of taking things off their plate that they shouldn't have to deal with, supporting them when they are running into challenges. That is the critical thing right now. And so I say you got to be in a school where a principal supports you. Because if you have that, then I say, like, give yourself a little bit of a break. Don't feel that you have to do all the things all the time. Like, and the other part of it, and this is easy to say, but I also think, in the end, this will help you, is going back to what I said earlier on in our conversation about inviting students to be part of it. Recognize this is not your education, it's theirs. So continuing to invite them to be part of that. And that means for those children who seem resistant or not wanting to take your invitation, you got to keep finding ways to invite them back into the game. Like, here, maybe this will be and you know what? It's possible that in the end, you might not be able to win, and they might not ever take you up on your invitation. And so, the time they spend with you won't be as successful as it might have been. But that has to be a little bit on them, right? Like, your job is to create the invitation, but they have to take you up on that. They have to at some point take you up on that. And listen, I taught first grade, so that's a little different in terms of their abilities to recognize that. And I'm sure I know I made lots of mistakes. I wasn't necessarily the best teacher there ever was. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm just, in hindsight, that's what I should have been doing if I wasn't, right? Is continuing to find ways to invite them into the learning experience and create opportunities for them to find a space to do it. But it's got to be a bit of a shared experience. And as you get older with older students, there's certainly more ownership that they can take on in this thing. But it's their education. It's not yours. It's theirs. And you're just there to provide the opportunities for them to succeed. But they have to accept your invitation.
So this next question is a bit of a two-part question. I want you to envision education 50 years out from now. What are the really positive things you see? And then the other side to that, what are the things that concern you? And again, I know this is going to be imperfect science. We're forecasting 50 years, and I wouldn't have been able to predict the last 3.
Well, it depends what days you're asking me. Some days I'm pretty optimistic. Some days I'm pretty pessimistic. I'm a little bit more optimistic.
You can give me both today.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic today, I think, because I'm seeing people acknowledge and recognize the role of humanity in education. We're starting to recognize that school isn't really a place just to get content. We've been having this conversation for 20 plus years. The internet really began to push this. I mean, this was kind of always the thing before, but access to information made it start that conversation that, wait a minute, school can't just be about learning stuff. It has to be more than that. We're still sort of sorting out what exactly that means as far as the human experience and what roles we want. And I think generative AI is now pushing that to the next level of that just says, oh, we not only do we need humans as part, but we want humans as part of it, that we desire that. That's a preferred method. And I think COVID's pointed that out so clearly that, oh yeah, we want teachers. We want to have that relationship with students and teachers. So I think the future is going to be more about that kind of a mentoring kind of experience. And so really continuing to shift the role of instructor to facilitator to actual mentor. I think that will be the role. And that's what I see in the positive, is that role shifting. I also think potentially what could be good is just greater flexibility in what school is. I mean, we've very much confined school to a pretty rigid structure of grades, of structure of time and place, all those things that are very fixed. I think those things will begin to, in 50 years, I hope kind of broke down even more so that, learning doesn't take place. I think going back to the idea of teachers as mentors, I think we sort of know that maturation of kids we know that the brain doesn't fully develop till the kids are actually in their 20s. So I hope this doesn't push us to, have more and more kids. Well, I know enough stuff now, I can go out in the world and be successful, because I don't think that ends well. So I think we'll have to be careful of that. I think the other thing that we'll have to be careful of, the ugly part of this, is that increased divide, right? So the haves and the have-nots is going to get even greater. So the kids of means, the kids that have opportunities, will potentially accelerate even farther. And so the disparities between whether it's rich and poor or whatever the criteria is could get worse, because technology will accelerate a lot of these negative things. And so we're kind of in a bit of a important time right now as we begin to map out more clearly how we think these new technologies ought to be used and in what ways. So I think we have to be very thoughtful in the way we're approaching them, because it could end badly. And there's days where I think it might end badly. But that's, I think when I think about the future, that's kind of where my hope is right now, is that people are going to start to really lean into those relationships and see the value in that, is that having a caring, trusting, smart adult as part of your child's life is very invaluable. I mean, we know that with whether it's coaches or other community members, friends that you have, like you value that as much as you do anything, that your kids know adults who care about them and can teach them and can be a part of their lives.
I think beautifully put. So with that, what podcast, book, video, movie, album would you recommend? I know you always have several on the go and lined up, and are recommending a ton to me. So what's something that you've been into lately?
Well, I just started a new book, and I don't know where it's going to go. And it's one of these ones where every once in a while, I don't know, it's hard to go into, like, I always used to think it happened occasionally back in the day where, like, I'd pick a movie and I'd go to, and I knew nothing about the movie. I saw the title and the poster, and that was it. And it was kind of a fun, surprise. So I started reading a book, and I'm about 5 chapters in. It's called The 5 Wishes of Mr. Murray McBride. And it's about a 100-year-old man who makes a difference in 2 people's lives. And that's about all I know right now. I'm kind of just following his journey. Interesting, as my dad is 92 and still, very, very active. Kind of reminds me a lot of this guy who's 100 in the book. So that was because that was the first thing I thought of to do, but there's lots more.
Certainly appreciate
what else
any
could I
shout
give
out to Elmo Shareski, one of my favorite humans.
Yeah, I'm just going through my podcast. I mean, of course, I could give you hours and hours of golf related podcasts, but that may not be what people are looking at for today. I listen. I always I plug it because I think it's always got something there that everybody will like, and that is 99% Invisible is a podcast that always kind of, and I'm always fascinated by that, because it's a bit of a, always the behind the scenes thing, right? Or like, what's the obvious thing that you see every day, but there's this invisible thing going on behind it that you don't understand. And I think that's a theme that I love, whether it's in sports or everything else. That's like, we see things very on a surface level, but know that, wait, there's got to be more to it than that. There's more to the story than that. And so any kind of theme that gives me a sort of an inside baseball, behind the scenes look at things always fascinates me, even if it's That's not necessarily a topic that I know much about or even care much about. I just think like, oh, that's fascinating that's how that works. I didn't know that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do here with your help for education, help folks understand a little bit more about the systems and what the concerns are and what areas we can be hopeful for. So with that, Dean Shareski, thank you for your time.
Thanks. It's fun.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Buccheri. Until next time.